They said Evelyn Hart had finally lost her senses when she gave away the last cow that stood between her and hunger. But by the time the sun climbed over the dry Wyoming hills the next morning, the sound of iron-rimmed wheels rolling toward her broken gate would make every one of them remember her name. The land around her little ranch stretched wide and empty, 40 acres of tired grass and stubborn dirt that hadn't seen proper rain in near 11 months. The kind of land that taught a person how to endure or how to leave, and Evelyn had never been the leaving kind. Her house leaned slightly to the west from years of prairie wind, the paint long since peeled into pale ghosts of white, her barn missing 3 boards along the south wall, where cold air slipped through at night like an uninvited guest. For 8 years since her husband Thomas passed from a winter sickness that took more strength than any storm ever had, she had kept the place alive with nothing but calloused hands and a quiet promise she never spoke out loud. The cow, a gentle brown Jersey she called Mabel, had been the last living piece of that promise, for gallons of milk on a good day, enough butter to trade in town once a month, enough hope to believe she might last another season. Folks in the nearest settlement 12 miles down the road said survival out here came down to numbers, pounds of feed, inches of rain, dollars owed. But Evelyn had always believed survival came down to choices made when nobody was watching. The night before had been colder than it should have been for late spring, the kind of cold that made breath show silver in lantern light. And when the stranger came walking out of the dark with a sick child wrapped in a worn blanket, his boots powdered with trail dust from at least 20 miles of hard travel, Evelyn hadn't asked for his name right away. She had only looked at the girl's pale face, the shallow breathing, the way small fingers trembled even in sleep, and she had understood something simple and final. The man had offered money he clearly didn't have enough of, offered to work, offered to come back with payment. Evelyn had just shaken her head slowly and said, "Take her. She needs the milk more than I do." She untied Mabel herself, fingers steady even while something inside her chest tightened like rope pulled too far, and she kept only the small brass bell from the leather strap, the same bell Thomas had hung there years ago, so he could always hear where his best cow wandered. After they disappeared into the night, the silence settled heavy across the property. No low breathing from the stall, no soft shifting hooves, just wind brushing dry weeds against the fence like whispers from another life. At sunrise, she sat on the porch with a tin cup of black coffee stretched thin, listening to nothing, owning almost nothing, yet carrying herself the same as always, straight-backed, eyes calm, because some people out here measured wealth in cattle, and some measured it in the kind of person they could still be when everything else was gone. That was why when the first distant rumble reached her ears just past 8 in the morning, a deep rolling sound like thunder with no clouds in the sky, Evelyn did not stand right away. She simply listened. Then the dust began to rise along the long road beyond her fence line, slow at first, then building, until shapes formed inside it. Wagons, horses, canvas tops, sunlight flashing off metal, more movement than her quiet land had seen in years. And as the caravan drew closer, dozens of eyes turning toward the smallest, poorest ranch for miles, Evelyn Hart set her cup down, the little brass bell resting silent in her palm, and waited without fear. The Mercer caravan did not rush as it approached, and that was the first thing Evelyn noticed, because people who meant trouble usually came fast and loud, but these wagons rolled with the slow confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged. The lead wagon was painted a faded forest green with gold lettering worn thin by years of weather, Mercer Trading Company barely visible along the side, and the horses pulling it were broad-shouldered draft animals with brushed coats and well-kept harness leather that spoke of long roads and careful hands. Evelyn remained by her gate, boots planted in the dry earth, her gray work dress moving softly in the breeze, her sun hat shading eyes that had learned long ago how to read people before they ever spoke. She counted without meaning to, 1 wagon, then 3, then 8 more behind them, each carrying crates, water barrels, rolled canvas, and supplies tied down with clean rope. This was not a desperate group. This was a moving town. A small boy sitting beside one of the drivers pointed toward her ranch with open curiosity, not mockery, and that alone felt different from how most strangers looked at her place. The wagons finally slowed until the sound of wooden wheels faded into quiet creaks, leather shifting, horses breathing deep after miles of trail. No one reached for anything. No one shouted. They simply stopped. Evelyn became aware then of how empty her barn looked behind her, how the open stall where Mabel had stood now held nothing but shadows and old straw. She did not regret her choice, but she did feel the weight of it in practical ways. The missing sound of milk hitting a tin pail, the missing warmth of a living creature in winter plans she had not yet solved. From the corner of her eye she saw two riders from the nearby settlement watching from the ridge half a mile off, drawn by the sight of so many wagons stopping at the poorest ranch in the valley. She knew what they were thinking. Trouble always found the weak first. Yet the man who finally stepped down from the lead wagon did not carry himself like trouble. He moved with the careful stiffness of someone past 60, tall, straight, wearing a dark vest despite the growing heat, his silver hair tied neatly at the back of his neck. His boots touched the ground with purpose, but not dominance. He paused for a moment, as if giving the land itself time to accept his presence. Evelyn noticed details because details had kept her alive: the clean cuffs, the watch chain, the way the others waited for him without being told. Leadership without noise. Authority without display. The man looked at her ranch, at the sagging roof line, the tired fencing, the dry pasture stretching 20 yards past the well, and something unreadable passed through his eyes. Not pity, not judgment, recognition. Behind him, one more familiar figure climbed down from the second wagon, hat in hand, shoulders dusty from travel. The same man who had walked into her lantern light the night before. Jonah Pike looked different. In daylight, relief softening his face. And when Evelyn saw the small girl sitting upright beside him, color back in her cheeks, wrapped in a clean blanket instead of the desperate one from the night before, Evelyn finally allowed herself one slow breath she did not realize she had been holding. The little brass bell in her hand remained silent, but for the first time since sunrise, it no longer felt like the last thing she owned. Jonah Pike removed his hat as he approached her, not as a performance, but as something instinctive, the kind of gesture a man carried from how he was raised rather than who he stood in front of, and for a moment he seemed unsure what words could possibly be enough. The morning sun had climbed high enough now to warm the dust around their boots, and somewhere behind the line of wagons a kettle lid rattled while someone prepared coffee, ordinary sounds that somehow made the moment feel even larger. Jonah stopped about 10 feet from Evelyn, giving her space the way a respectful man does when he knows he owes more than he can easily repay. The little girl slid carefully down from the wagon seat with his help, her small boots touching the ground with surprising strength, her dark hair brushed clean, her eyes clear in a way they had not been the night before. She held a tin cup in both hands and took a careful sip of fresh milk, and Evelyn recognized the pale color immediately. Mabel had always given milk that shade, rich and steady, the kind that came from a calm animal. Jonah cleared his throat once before speaking, his voice quiet but steady. "Ma'am, I did not come back to take anything more from you. I came because a man ought to stand where his thanks can be heard." Evelyn said nothing. She only watched the child. The girl looked back with the open seriousness children sometimes carried when they understood something important had been done for them. "I am called Clara," the girl said softly, each word careful, as if she had practiced it. "My grandfather says I am supposed to thank you proper." Evelyn nodded once. "That is a good name," she said, her voice even. "Strong name." The older man from the lead wagon stepped closer then, not interrupting but joining his presence, changing the air without force. Up close, Evelyn could see the years in his face, the sun lines earned from decades on the trail, the kind of man who had built something not from luck, but from endurance. Gideon Mercer extended his hand, not to command, but to introduce himself as an equal. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Gideon Mercer. What you did last night kept the only family I have left breathing this morning." Evelyn did not take his hand right away. Instead, she glanced at the wagons, the supplies, the well-fed horses, then back at Clara. She spoke simply. Any decent person would have done the same. Gideon gave the smallest shake of his head. "No, ma'am. That is where you are mistaken. We asked 3 ranches before yours. One man said he could not spare the milk. Another said payment first. The last one said winter was coming early this year and shut his door." He let the words rest there like stones placed carefully. "You were the only one who did not ask what you might lose." Evelyn looked down at the small brass bell still resting in her palm, her thumb brushing the worn metal edge where Thomas had once polished it with a rag every Sunday. Sometimes, she answered quietly, a body just knows when something matters more than numbers. Clara stepped forward then, holding out the cup with both hands. There was still milk inside, warm from the morning. I saved some for you, she said. Evelyn hesitated only a second before accepting it. The taste was simple, familiar, honest. For the first time since the wagons arrived, something unspoken passed between everyone standing there, not about debt, not about trade, but about the rare moment when a single quiet decision proved that kindness still traveled farther than fear on the American frontier. The cup felt warm in Evelyn's hands long after Clara let go of it. And for a brief moment the world seemed balanced on something fragile and rare, the kind of quiet understanding that did not need signatures or witnesses. Then the sound of another horse approaching broke the stillness, slow hoofbeats coming up the dry road from the east, familiar in a way that tightened something behind Evelyn's ribs. She did not need to turn to know who it would be. Clyde Barrow always rode like a man who believed the land already belonged to him, shoulders stiff, chin lifted, a leather folder tied behind his saddle like a badge of importance he had given himself. He pulled his horse to a stop about 15 yards from the gate, his eyes moving over the long line of wagons, the polished harness, the stacked crates, the well-fed teams, and confusion flickered across his face before he covered it with the same thin smile he used in town when talking about other people's debts. Morning, Mrs. Hart, he called, his voice carrying the tone of a man used to being obeyed. Seems you have company. Evelyn did not answer right away. She set the empty tin cup carefully on the fence post, as if she had all the time in the world. Just travelers, she said. Clyde gave a short breath through his nose. Travelers usually do not stop here. His eyes moved toward Gideon Mercer, measuring, calculating, trying to place him in some mental ledger. I was planning to stop by this afternoon, he continued, tapping the folder against his saddle horn, but since I am here, I might as well remind you where things stand. Jonah Pike shifted slightly, not stepping forward, just adjusting his weight the way a man does when he is ready to stand beside someone without making a show of it. Clyde went on, voice smooth, practiced. 3 months overdue on the note. Standard agreement says the property transfers by sundown tomorrow if payment is not made in full. He said it loudly enough for the caravan drivers to hear, the way some men like their authority to have an audience. Evelyn had heard these words before. They did not land any differently now. I remember what I signed, she replied calmly. Clyde nodded as if satisfied. Good. Then we understand each other. His gaze drifted toward the empty barn door, the hollow stall visible even from where he sat. Hard season to be without stock, he added. Hard to make money without something to sell. A few of the settlement watchers had come closer along the road now, drawn by the possibility of watching a quiet ending to a long struggle. Evelyn felt their eyes the way a person feels weather changing. Gideon Mercer finally spoke then, his voice neither loud nor sharp, but carrying the kind of steadiness that made people listen without knowing why. Sir, he said, I believe we have not been introduced. Clyde straightened slightly in his saddle. Clyde Barrow, Land Office. Gideon Mercer offered a small nod. Mercer Trading Company. The name landed slowly. Recognition followed. Clyde's expression shifted almost too fast to notice. The same company that supplied rail camps 2 states over. The same name stamped on freight crates in every growing town. For the first time that morning, Clyde removed his hat. Well now, he said carefully, that is different. Gideon's eyes moved once toward Evelyn, then back. I was just speaking with Mrs. Hart about a matter of gratitude, he said. Clyde looked between them, uncertainty replacing confidence in careful degrees, because the story he expected to see unfolding in front of him no longer seemed to belong to him at all. Clyde Barrow shifted in his saddle as if the ground beneath him had changed without warning, and for a long second he said nothing, which was unusual for a man who normally filled silence with reminders of contracts and consequences. The wind moved softly through the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of coffee from the caravan and the clean animal smell of strong horses that had traveled hundreds of miles without losing condition. Gideon Mercer did not step closer, did not raise his voice, did not do anything that looked like power, yet the men beside the wagons watched him with the quiet attention given to someone whose decisions shaped their livelihoods. Clyde cleared his throat. Well, he said slowly, business is business. Gratitude is a fine thing, but paperwork does not change because of sentiment. Evelyn remained still beside the fence, her hand resting lightly on the weathered wood as if she had grown from the same stubborn material. Gideon nodded once. I agree completely. Business should always be clear. That is why I prefer to settle matters directly. He reached into his vest pocket and removed a small leather notebook, worn at the corners from years of use, and flipped it open with the ease of someone who kept careful records. May I ask the amount owed, Mr. Barrow? Clyde hesitated only briefly before answering. $187.40, including interest and filing costs. A fair number for this territory. Gideon repeated the number quietly, as if weighing it, then closed the notebook without writing anything down. That is not an unreasonable sum, he said. Clyde seemed relieved by the answer, as if the world had returned to its familiar shape. Most people could not gather that much in a year out here, he added, his confidence returning in small pieces. Gideon looked toward Evelyn again, then toward the empty barn, then at the brass bell still resting in her hand. Yesterday, he said, this woman gave away the only thing standing between her and losing everything. She did not know who we were. She did not ask what she might gain. Clyde gave a small shrug. Charity does not cancel contracts. No, Gideon agreed softly. But character changes how men decide to honor them. He turned slightly and gestured toward one of the wagons. A younger driver climbed down carrying a narrow wooden box reinforced with iron corners. The sound of the latch opening seemed louder than it should have been in the still air. Inside were neat stacks of paper currency and silver coins wrapped in cloth rolls. Not displayed like a show, just present. Gideon did not touch the money. He simply looked back at Clyde. You said $187.40. Please add any proper recording fees so that everything is finished correctly. Clyde stared at the box longer than he meant to. The watching townsmen along the road had grown completely silent now, sensing something they would talk about for years. Clyde finally dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with less certainty than before. He opened his folder, checked the numbers again, then named a final total of $192 even. Gideon gave a small nod to the driver, who counted the amount with careful fingers and placed it into Clyde's waiting hands. No triumph, no speech, just completion. Clyde looked down at the money, then at Evelyn, then back at Gideon. For the first time since anyone in the valley could remember, he seemed unsure what role he was supposed to play. Evelyn did not smile. She did not thank anyone. She only stood there with the same quiet dignity she had held when she owned nothing, because some victories on the frontier did not arrive with noise, only with the simple return of a future that had almost been taken away. For a long moment after, the money changed hands. Nobody moved, as if the entire valley needed time to understand that something ordinary had just turned into something rare. Clyde Barrow folded the bills slowly, more carefully than he ever had when collecting from desperate farmers, and placed them into his leather folder with hands that no longer looked entirely certain. He cleared his throat again, but whatever speech he had prepared about obligations and consequences no longer seemed to fit the moment. Business concluded, he finally said, though the words sounded smaller than usual. He gave a short nod toward Gideon Mercer, then toward Evelyn, and mounted his horse without another remark. As he rode away down the same dry road he had come from, the small group of onlookers followed at a distance, their quiet voices already beginning to shape the story that would reach the general store before nightfall. The sound of his horse faded, and with it went the last shadow that had hung over Evelyn's land for months. Gideon waited until the dust settled before speaking again, because he was the kind of man who understood that dignity sometimes required silence before words. Mrs. Hart, he said gently, there is one more matter, if you will allow it. Evelyn gave a small nod, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady. Gideon gestured toward the third wagon, and two of his men began unloading supplies with practiced movements, not hurried, not ceremonial, just respectful. A wooden crate of seed corn, a stack of cut lumber, a bundle of new fence posts, a water barrel freshly tar-sealed. Practical things. Things meant for staying, not passing through. Evelyn watched without interrupting. I did not ask for charity, she said quietly. Gideon smiled faintly. Neither did we offer it. He paused, then continued. Your husband, Thomas Hart. Was he a tall man with a quiet way of speaking and a habit of fixing harness straps for anyone who asked? The question landed like a pebble in still water. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the brass bell. He was, she answered. Gideon nodded slowly, memory moving across his face. 17 years ago, my freight line was caught in a late-season snow near Bitter Creek Pass. One of my drivers nearly froze when his rig broke loose. Your husband rode 6 miles in that storm to bring him back. Refused payment. Said a man should not profit from doing what is right. Evelyn said nothing. She only listened. I have been trying to find that man's family for years, Gideon continued, not to repay a debt, but to honor a standard. Yesterday, without knowing it, you showed the same measure. He looked toward the barn, then back at her. We have a supply route forming through this valley starting next spring. We need a place where our wagons can water, repair, and rest without trouble. He let the meaning settle before finishing. If you are willing, we would like to make this ranch our regular stopping point. Fair payment. Honest contracts. No favors. Just partnership. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than any offer of money could have. Evelyn looked past him at the wagons, at Clara laughing softly with one of the drivers, at the strong teams stamping patiently in the dust, at the lumber already stacked near her broken fence. For the first time in many seasons, she could see not just survival, but time ahead measured in plans instead of worries. She closed her hand around the small brass bell, feeling its familiar weight, and gave the smallest nod. That sounds like something worth building, she said. The agreement was not written that day, not with ink and signatures, but in the way men began working without being told, and in the way Evelyn found herself standing in the middle of her own yard watching something she had not seen in years, progress. One of the Mercer men measured the broken fence line with a length of cord, counting steps under his breath, while another unloaded a hammer and a leather pouch filled with square nails that caught the sunlight like small pieces of silver. The steady sound of wood being set straight again carried across the dry pasture, a sound more hopeful than any promise. Evelyn moved slowly toward the barn as if she needed to see it from closer to believe it was no longer empty in the same way. Clara followed a few steps behind her, not speaking at first, just walking with the quiet curiosity of a child who had learned how quickly life could change. Miss Evelyn, Clara finally asked, did you know you were saving me? Evelyn rested her hand against the barn door frame, feeling the rough grain beneath her palm. No, she answered honestly. I only knew someone needed help. Clara seemed to think about that for a long moment. My grandfather says most people only help when they know who is watching. Evelyn gave a faint smile. Then your grandfather has seen a great many people. Clara nodded as if that confirmed something important. Behind them, Jonah Pike was working beside the others without being asked, lifting fence posts into place, setting them straight with the care of a man trying to repay something that could not be measured in hours. At one point he paused and approached Evelyn again, his expression thoughtful. Ma'am, he said, I wanted you to know something. Last night, when you handed me that lead rope, I thought you were either the bravest person I had met or the most desperate. Evelyn glanced toward the open field where Mabel used to graze. Which was it? She asked. Jonah considered this before answering. I think now it was neither. I think you just knew who you were. The words settled deep because they carried no praise, only truth. By midday the changes were already visible. The broken section of fence stood straight again. A new water trough sat near the well. Someone had even patched the worst hole in the barn roof with fresh boards that still smelled of pine sap. None of it was grand. None of it was meant to impress. It was the kind of work meant to last. Gideon Mercer watched it all from near his wagon, his hands folded behind his back, satisfied in the quiet way of a man who believed the best results spoke for themselves. When Evelyn approached him, he spoke without turning. Your husband once told one of my drivers that land remembers how it is treated. Neglect it, and it gives up. Care for it, and it tries again. Evelyn looked across the pasture where small clouds of dust lifted under the hooves of strong horses. Thomas believed that, she said. Gideon finally looked at her. So do I. That is why we choose our stopping places carefully. Evelyn followed his gaze toward the road stretching beyond her gate, the same road that yesterday had only carried worry toward her door. Now it carried possibility. She turned the small brass bell once in her fingers, then hung it on a new nail beside the barn entrance. The sound it made was soft, clear, alive again. By late afternoon, the sun had turned the prairie gold, that soft western light that made even worn places look like they still had stories left in them, and Evelyn found herself standing near the well watching shadows grow longer across ground she had almost lost. The Mercer men worked with the rhythm of people who understood that good work did not need to be rushed to be strong. A new gate had been set straight where the old one had leaned for years, its hinges moving smooth and quiet, the kind of sound that meant tomorrow would open easier than yesterday. Clara sat on an overturned water bucket nearby, her small boots swinging a few inches above the dirt, holding a biscuit one of the cooks had given her, carefully breaking it in half so she could offer part of it to a tired trail dog that had followed the wagons for 3 states. Evelyn noticed that. Small kindness recognizing small kindness. Gideon Mercer approached her once more as the sky began to soften into evening colors, his expression thoughtful in the way of a man finishing business that mattered beyond profit. "There is something else that belongs with this place," he said quietly. He signaled to Jonah Pike, who returned carrying a folded canvas bundle about 3 feet long. When he opened it, inside was a wooden sign, freshly painted but in an old style of lettering. Evelyn stepped closer without speaking. The words Red Heart Supply Stop, Mercer Route. Beneath it, in smaller letters, water, rest, honest trade. Evelyn drew a slow breath. "I have never run a business," she said. Gideon gave a slight smile. "You already have. You traded something valuable for nothing in return when it mattered most. That is the only qualification that cannot be taught." The sign was mounted beside her gate with 4 square nails, set carefully into the same post that had once held a foreclosure notice. No ceremony followed. No applause. Just the quiet understanding among the caravan that a new point on their map now existed because one person had chosen decency when it was hardest. As evening settled, one of the drivers led forward 2 healthy young cows with clean coats and steady eyes, their reins handed gently to Evelyn without speech. "Not a gift," Gideon clarified. "Advance. Payment for the first season of stops. Fair value." Evelyn accepted the reins with both hands, feeling the familiar weight return, not of charity, but of earned trust. Clara ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the new sign. "Does this mean we will come back?" she asked. Gideon rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "It means we now have a reason to." As the caravan prepared to move again, harness chains clinking softly, wheels creaking back into motion, Evelyn stood by the gate holding the reins, the brass bell above the barn door catching the last light. One by one the wagons rolled past, drivers tipping their hats not out of obligation, but respect freely given. When the last wagon disappeared into the long western road, the silence that returned did not feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Evelyn turned toward her barn, the new cattle walking calmly beside her, and for the first time in many seasons she was not thinking about what she had lost, only about what she now had the chance to build. That night the prairie grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one Evelyn Hart had known before, not the silence of something fading away, but the silence of something beginning to breathe again. The 2 new cows settled into the barn with the slow, calm movements of animals that had traveled far but sensed good ground beneath them, their steady breathing filling the space that had once echoed with absence. Evelyn moved among them with practiced hands, checking water, brushing dust from their coats, speaking softly the way her husband had always done, because he believed animals listen more to tone than to words. When she finished, she stepped back outside and looked across her land under the wide American sky, the stars beginning to appear one by one like lanterns hung by patient hands. The new sign beside her gate creaked gently in the evening breeze, the fresh paint still carrying the faint smell of oil and promise. Heart Supply Stop. 3 simple words, yet they changed how the road would see her from now on. The next morning came with the ordinary sounds of work instead of worry. At first light, she measured out feed, checked the repaired fence, and drew a full bucket of cold well water without counting how many days she had left. Before noon, a single rider stopped, then another wagon near midday, small traders who had already heard the news moving faster than any official notice. They asked if they might water their teams. They asked what she charged. Evelyn answered the only way she knew how. Fair measure. Honest price. No trouble. By the end of the week, the ruts near her gate had deepened from passing wheels, and the empty shelf inside her small storage room began to hold sacks of flour, lamp oil, salt blocks, and simple tools traded through quiet agreements sealed with handshakes. Nora Finch from the settlement rode past one afternoon, slowing just enough to see the new fence and the healthy cattle. She did not speak. She only nodded once before continuing down the road, the kind of acknowledgement that meant the old judgments had quietly ended. Even Clyde Barrow returned weeks later with updated papers showing the property clear and properly recorded, his manner stripped of the edge it once carried. Business looks different when people stand behind you, he admitted before leaving. Through it all, Evelyn remained the same woman who had stood alone with nothing but a decision to make. Each evening, she rang the small brass bell hanging by the barn door, not loudly, just enough to hear its clear note drift across the yard, a reminder that what had saved her was never luck or charity, but the simple fact that she had chosen to be the kind of person her husband believed she already was. Out on that long western road, where fortunes came and went like weather, people would later say her life changed because a caravan stopped at her gate. But the truth was quieter than that. The real change had happened the moment she gave something away with no witness, no guarantee, and no fear. Out there, that was how justice often arrived, not with noise, not with force, but with the slow, certain return of what a person had already proven they deserved.